Face-to-face encounters are precarious moments, obviously prone to countless variations. Still, it seems that a pattern within the narrative, stylistic, and rhetorical strategies employed can be discerned as illustrated by a selection of passages such as the constitutive encounter between the persona and the Italian militiaman in Homage to Catalonia, and Bozo in The Tramp from Fond of Stars in Down and Out in Paris and London, which can be put into perspective with constructions of authority present in Orwell's early novels. These scenes that I will briefly study reveal how the sharing of a contemporaneity is a precondition for the initiation of what we may call a truly ethical relation towards the other, in opposition with forms of writing which relegate the other not only to a different space, but also to another time. The incipit of Homage to Catalonia, it does not begin with an account of the reasons that drove the persona to Barcelona and fighting the Spanish Civil War, nor does it start by depicting the Lenin barracks in which he arrives. The very first sentence actually describes an encounter with an Italian militiaman. The apparition of this man seems to have sprung from nowhere, as stressed by the importance of the gaze, not a reciprocal one here, of the persona on the militiaman. So it starts by, I quote, "I saw an Italian militiaman standing in front of the officer's table." This immediately sets the importance, obviously, of the figure of the other, of the human being whom we encounter for the first time, and with whom we share a great number of similarities, but who appears, at least at first, necessarily other, unfamiliar, strange. And this duality seems to be acutely rendered by this man's face in particular, which is regarded by the persona as, I quote, "a mixture of candor and ferocity." We then learn that the man in question is having a hard time deciphering a map put on a table by his superior. The observed in turn becomes the observer, a puzzled decipherer, which leads the narrator to note, I quote, "the pathetic reverence that illiterate people have for their supposed superiors," thus asserting an intellectual point of view. Nonetheless, this is not an opportunity to manifest his superiority. We could discuss this. On the contrary, precisely because of the observation of the man's difficulties in reading this map, the narrator concludes that he has seldom, if ever, I quote, "seen a man to whom he has taken such an immediate liking." The impossibility of fully rationalizing this immediate liking, demonstrated by the phrase, "I hardly know why," seems to concur with Johannes Fabian's insistence on passion rather than action in first encounters, somewhat befalling us out of our control at the moment the other enters one's existence. As previously stated, the gaze of the persona is a double one. It is simultaneously that of a stranger and that of a sympathetic onlooker to a certain extent. It seems therefore particularly telling that once the Italian militiaman finds out that the narrator is a foreigner, he very innocently and quickly assumes that he is an Italian like himself. After the persona tells him in Spanish he is British, Italiano, no, Inglés, in Spanish, yes. The militiaman raises his head in order to enable the actual encounter, the face-to-face between the two men to take place. The obstacle of language seems to appear momentarily meaningless, and both men become united by their status as foreigners in a Spanish land. This illustrates, I quote, how the knowledge of others is gained through communicative practices that require that both sides be able to transcend the confines of their culture by reaching a common ground or by traveling, as it were, back and forth between the ground on which they stand. And again, this is a quotation of Johann Fabian's work. The encounter is then sealed with a very strong handshake between the two men, as the militiaman reaches out to the persona by gripping his hand very hard. This is a quote from the incipit. And it is a move which materializes, of course, a physical but also a mental reaching out. This immediate liking appears therefore to be felt on both sides, and this is emphasized by the author's choice to place the general sentence, "Queer the affection you can feel for a stranger," just after mentioning the strong handshake initiated by the militiaman. This instant bonding, which seems to be only partially expressed by words, is thus conspicuous thanks to Orwell's search for the most apt style and rhetoric to transcribe it, as shown by the alternation between somewhat colloquial terms connoting innocent surprise, and that is the term queer, that Orwell often used, and we could develop say more things about that, and on the other hand, a more solemn, highly wrought style accompanied by the simile, and this is visible in the sentence. It was as though his spirit and mind had momentarily succeeded in bridging the gulf of language and tradition and meeting in utter intimacy. Thanks to an apparently simple yet effective simile, Orwell makes us seize the simultaneous unicity and innumerable recurrence of the mechanisms underlying an encounter leading to mutual recognition that is both powerful and ephemeral, short-lived yet long-lasting, particular and universal. This is why this sentence is particularly revelatory of his search for a style adapted to the sharing of these mechanisms and the writing of otherness, invoking not only oneself and one other, but also a writer and what could be considered his counterpart, his other, in other words, his reader. As for the reference to tradition, it seems that it can be linked to the most crucial condition for co-evilness, shared time, between two participants to take place, and that is the fact. So it seems, indeed, despite the fact that these two men have very different pasts, backgrounds, and traditions, it becomes possible for them, even if they do not ever see each other again after that, to share one moment in time, a unique one, that of their encounter, of their immediate liking for one another, and above all, the reciprocal recognition of the time that they have shared. This is certainly a fragile and precarious matter, which is at stake here, as the narrator adds the following, I quote, "I also knew that to retain my first impression of him, I must not see him again, and needless to say that I did never see him again." Finally, the following assertion, which is, I quote, "I hope he liked me as well as I liked him," emphasizes once more the form of reaching out to one's abandonment of the idea of completely controlling the situation, which is necessary for the recognition of the coevalence between the observer and the observed. And this is due to the fact that at the very moment of the advent of another person's space, such total control is impossible. Thus, this makes vulnerability a necessity. And it seems that this scene illustrates Orwell's reflection both on somewhat universal values encapsulated in the poem and the Christian spirit that I mentioned earlier on, and on the one hand, and on the particular on the other, the marginal, the silenced, the subaltern. He insists on a physical embodiment, an incarnation, we may say, of a communicational ethics which precisely reportage literature will best convey with its form of realism, that it reintroduces the possibility of the event, of the accidental encounter, of the unexpected relationship, exploding the conventional expected differentiating